Welcome to the SEA Center's new podcast, Perspectives. We are a New Delhi based think tank, and this podcast is a platform for our researchers to discuss technology policy issues in an accessible format. In today's episode of Perspectives, we explore the debate around the environmental costs of artificial intelligence and how it may disproportionately impact the global south. We also discuss the proposed solutions to make artificial intelligence more sustainable.
Okay, so we've been using AI for everything. We've been using it to design our thumbnails. We're using it to streamline a lot of processes that would have added hours to our daily schedule, right? And that's not just us. All of us have been using AI, and we're hooked onto it. Recently, I was reading the newspaper, and I came across the UN climate conference, the COP29, and they've had many panels discussing the impact of AI on the environment, the emission it produces, and apparently, it's a huge cause for concern, and that has been debated across the world, but there's no tangible action that we've seen. So, what would a sustainable AI model look like, and what can we potentially do?
Yeah, I think it's a really pertinent issue, especially given that right now we're trying to reduce emissions, and given that AI is emerging as this sort of revolutionary technology which is going to be applied across sectors and possibly even help achieve some of the sustainable development goals. The fact that it can lead to rapid increases in emission is something of concern. But I think before we start discussing what a sustainable approach is, it's important to understand why AI produces or uses so much energy and produces so many carbon emissions, right? And I think the best way to do that is sort of to split it into two parts of the process. The first being the training stage, and the second being the deployment stage. And here I'm generally mostly talking about large language foundational models, which power the applications that most of us use, whether that's ChatGPT or Claude or Google Gemini, right? So at the training phase, these models are essentially being trained on petabytes or zettabytes of data to be able to make inferences, recognize patterns, and produce outputs based on user prompts. And essentially, not only do you need power and electricity to power the data centers where all of this data is stored, but you also need a lot of power for the hardware that's involved in this, which are GPUs and TPUs and other sophisticated forms of hardware, right? So that is at the training phase. Now, second comes the deployment phase when we are actually interacting with these systems on a daily basis. So that's when either you or I or Shweta give a prompt to ChatGPT saying that, hey, can you help me generate a thumbnail for this podcast? So even at that point, a lot of energy goes into processing this query, coming up with an answer based on what the model learned during the training phase. And like you already mentioned, it takes 10 times more energy than a regular Google search. And on average, if you just stack it up, even say for 10 million queries a day, that's roughly equivalent to 117 gasoline cars. So we are dealing with an issue of a lot of scale. I think rough estimates based on data that's been released by some companies suggest that annually just training a model could take up anywhere up to 550 metric tons of CO2 emissions, which is really significant. And this doesn't even account for cooling. Now, cooling becomes really important because when you're training these models and data sets and they're processing queries, the servers tend to get heated up, and you need a lot of water based cooling to keep them cool and keep everything running intact. And estimates suggest that cooling actually forms the largest component of resource utilization during the model training and deployment phases. So, actually, throughout the value chain, we're looking at a really energy intensive and electricity intensive process, and which does have major ramifications for climate change mitigation.
Yeah, Mohit, in addition to your point, there are also concerns about environmental equity. So the idea is that the benefits that come from AI, economic, etc., tend to be concentrated within the global north, while the harms tend to be mostly internalized by countries within the global south. And it's also because if we look at the kind of resources that are required for AI to, be developed and deployed today, whether it's water, electricity, all the stuff you mentioned, these tend to be scarce within the global south. So you have, for instance, World Bank studies which find that only 35% of developing countries have access to the internet. You also have studies which say that countries like Chile, which tend to be drought prone, actually face severe problems when you need water, freshwater resources, because they basically just don't have enough of it and it exacerbates their existing problems. Similarly, even with electricity generation, you have a lot of air pollution which comes in because you use fossil fuels. There's also thermal pollution in water bodies. There's a production of hazardous waste materials. And if we look at the way AI energy demand is slated to go up, there are projections which say that it will exceed Belgium's energy consumption by 2026. So when you look at the scale of the energy consumption that's required, this is only going to make concerns about environmental equity worse. And, it's starting to become a real point of contention.
Yeah, that's why there have been so many reports about protests in South America. In countries like Chile and Uruguay, we see people protesting against the government, essentially allowing for creation of data centers on top of the existing data centers, which require a significant amount of water for cooling. And at the same time, they're undergoing a drought and they do not have enough for daily consumption and daily usage of their residents. But for the financial interests of the country, it's also a great investment opportunity. So these countries have to essentially undergo the whole balancing act of how much investment should they undertake and the cost of what natural resources, and it's created a very turbulent situation where citizens are out on the streets protesting, but these protests are being silenced as well.
Yeah, on a technical level, there have been some attempts to address this problem. So there are AI model architectures which basically enable more efficient energy consumption. There are also techniques like weight pruning and quantization that you can use to reduce the model size. There are also ways for you to deploy energy efficient GPUs and accelerators. But the problem is that you need something more institutional and more widespread, which is where actually COP comes in. So COP this year passed something which is the Declaration on Green Digital Action. So, the Green Digital Action Initiative actually started at COP 28, which was held in Dubai last year. And it was launched by the International Telecommunications Union in collaboration with other stakeholders. The idea was precisely to address this dilemma of the fact that digital technologies have the potential to unlock vast potential in our society. But the problem is that they come with environmental costs of their own. And what's happened this year in the declaration is that there have been 8 objectives which have been issued for countries to integrate into their climate strategies and policies. So these include objectives like leveraging digital tools and technologies for climate action, which can be using them to, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, climate monitoring and forecasting, building resilient digital infrastructure, ensuring that your digital systems withstand climate change, mitigating its adverse climate impact, which is reducing emissions, using clean energy sources, promoting energy efficient practices. On the point on environmental equity, there are also suggestions around digital inclusion and literacy, focusing on developing countries, least developed countries, and ensuring that they benefit from capacity building, digital skills transfer, and financing. There's a push for sustainable innovation as well, where you encourage funding and R&D into clean energy, sustainable digital infrastructure, and facilitate the sharing of best practices as well. And this declaration is a milestone because, as we mentioned earlier, there hasn't been a concerted international effort yet to tackle this problem. And now over 1,000 governments, companies, and civil society stakeholders have endorsed this plan. So I think it marks a milestone for us on this issue ahead.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it also lays the groundwork for future action in India. We're seeing already a lot of enabling policy from the government towards AI, whether that's through the India mission, which, among other things, seeks to provide access to cutting edge hardware to a lot of Indian developers and founders. But I think with the passing of this, with the adoption of this declaration, we'll also probably see sustainability related concerns factor into policy making at the highest levels as far as AI is concerned. And given its ability to accelerate our progress towards a lot of SDGs, if this problem related to sustainability and environmental concerns can be addressed, it can truly be a revolutionary technology like few others we've seen before.